Okay, so at this point, I think that so yeah, I muted you guys. At this point, I'm gonna just give a brief introduction, and then we're gonna get started on the class. I mentioned at the end of class last week about the conversion program that I am currently running. So just to kind of reiterate, if you know anybody who's interested in converting, please send them my direction. I'll talk with them. I'm working on the website right now. I hope to have that done by next week. And then we'll begin probably mid-June, which is about 1 month from now. But there's an application process anyway, so it's a good idea to get started. And that's a 1-year program that I'm doing through Rabbi Riskin from Efrat. And yeah, so if you know anybody who's doing that. Also, I didn't ask anybody to renew their membership for May because I missed 2 classes in April because I was sick. So I wanted to make that up. But now at this point, we're going on to next week will be basically a new month. And so what I want to ask everybody to do is to go ahead and renew next week if they can. And I will give you May and June for the price of 1 month. So that way then July will start at the beginning of the month, but this way I have the tuition coming in so that I can do the things that I need to do, and we'll keep going, and you guys get an extra couple of weeks of learning out of it. So that's kind of the business end of things. And yeah, so now at this point, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully a couple of more people will join us. I'm not sure. I know that Rivka said that she liked my post, so hopefully she will join us as soon as she can. And right, so today, this is Spiritual Mentoring Group. Today is May 7th, 2017. And last week, we talked about the counting of the Omer, which is the period of time between Passover, Pesach, and Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, okay? And we talked about the fact that 2 weeks in a row, we had double parshas, and why that happens, okay? So before we go into the Parsha for this week, I just wanted to finish up some thoughts that I wanted to touch on last week, but we ran out of time, on the Tanakh itself. Now, since you guys are my more advanced group, much of what I'm going to say tonight is probably going to be a review, but I never know what somebody knows and doesn't know, what holes they have in their knowledge. So it's nice to sometimes cover some basics. And even if you know everything that I'm about to teach, review is always good too. So, all right. Pretty much everybody knows that the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah, right? These are also often referred to as the 5 books of Moses, since Moses, or Moshe, was the person who authored most of it. And according to our tradition, basically he authored all of it except for the very last parsha, which marks his death. Okay, and it's said that Joshua was the one who wrote that last parsha. But anyway, so Moses authored it, and basically he's the main character. After the first few chapters in Genesis, Moses is pretty much the main character throughout the rest of the Torah. I mean, the Jewish people are the main character, but Moses really features very prominently because he was the leader of the Jewish people throughout most of the Torah. Okay, so now obviously the first part of Genesis, or Bereshit, was before Moses was born. But God instructed him to start the book with the creation of the world to set the foundation for everything that follows. All right. In fact, one might wonder why, if the Torah is about the journey of the Jewish people, why it doesn't begin with Abraham or Jacob, who really was the father of the nation of Israel, right? Abraham technically wasn't a Jew, okay? The first Jew, you could, depending on how you look at it, was either Jacob or Joseph, who was one of the 12 tribes, okay? But, Jacob was the one who was called Israel. He's the father of the nation of Israel. So it's interesting because Rashi, in his first comment on the Torah, and for those of you who may not be familiar, Rashi is considered one of the foremost commentators on the Torah. Pretty much everything he said is considered authoritative, and he wrote quite a lot about the Torah. So Rashi, in his first comment on the Torah, explains that the reason for the Torah's narrative of the creation, right? Why do we start with creation? Is to establish God's sovereignty over the universe, right? It says in Tehillim, Psalms 111, verse 6, he declared to his people the power of his works in order to give them the heritage of the nations. Right? So Rashi continues by saying that if the nations of the world were to accuse Israel of banditry for seizing the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan or Canaan, then, it's like brilliant insight, right, that this would happen. Israel can then respond, well, the entire universe belongs to God. He created it, and he granted it to whomever he deemed fit. It was his desire to give it to the Canaanites first, and then it was his desire to take it from them and give it to Israel. All right? So Rashi is saying that the reason that the Torah begins with the creation of the world is to establish God's authority to grant the land that he gave as an inheritance to the Jewish people. All right. Now, today we have a problem because not everybody believes the Bible. Much of the world is secular, especially the governments. And so a lot of people argue that you can't use the God defense for the nation of Israel being in the land of Israel. And it's hard, but what we can do is we can point to the fact that if the Bible, if the Torah is at all factual when it comes to historical information, then we know that the first people group living in the land of Israel was the Canaanites, and then Israel came in and conquered the land. So you could say that the indigenous people of the land of Israel were the Canaanites, except that the Canaanites don't exist today. So therefore, the oldest people group that have a claim to this land are the Jewish people. And so we are considered the indigenous people and therefore should have indigenous rights to the land. But anyway, so Rashi's explanation for why the Torah starts with Bereshit, with the creation of the world, is to establish that God has the right to do whatever he wants with it because he created it and he's the sovereign of the world, okay? After the books of the Torah, we have the grouping of books that are called the Nevi'im, or the prophets, okay? The prophets are divided into 2 groups. The first group is called the former prophets, or Nevi'im Rishonim, which actually means like the first prophets. And that includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. All right. And really, those 4 books are very much a continuation of the narrative from the Torah, right? Even Karaites, which are an offshoot of Judaism but deny the authority of the oral Torah or the Talmud, even they accept, for example, the book of Joshua. They accept the authority of the Torah and the book of Joshua. They don't accept any of the other prophets as authoritative, and they don't accept the oral Torah, but they do accept Joshua because the book of Joshua is a continuation of the Torah, all right? But so are Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They're all very narrative in their nature. And the second subgroup of the Nevi'im, or prophets, is what is referred to as the latter prophets. So you have the former prophets and you have the latter prophets. The latter prophets in Hebrew is Nevi'im Achronim. Okay, and this part includes the books of Isaiah or Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, which is Jeremiah, Yechezkel, which is Ezekiel, and what Christians often refer to as the 12 minor prophets. In Hebrew, they're simply called Trei Asar, or the 12, and they are treated, those 12 prophets are treated as one book, basically a collection of the writings of 12 prophets, okay? So the Trei Asar are Hosea, Yoel, Amos, Obadiah, okay? In English, it would be Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micha, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, or Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, or Zechariah, and Malachi, or Malachi, okay? So those are the 12, and they are the second part of the Tanakh that is called the Nevi'im, or the prophets, okay? After the Nevi'im, so you have the Torah and you have the Nevi'im, and after the Nevi'im, we have several more books, 11 to be exact, that are called the Ketuvim, or the writings. And this consists of 11 books, which are divided into 3 subgroups. The poetic books, the 5 scrolls, or Megillot, and then other books. Literally, that's what they're called, other books, okay? So the poetic books are Tehillim, which in English is Psalms, Mishlei, which is Proverbs, and Iyov, which is Job. Okay, so those are the 3 poetic books, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. These 3 books are referred to as Sifrei Emet, which means the books of truth. But the reason that it's called that is because the first letters of the names, Iyov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, spell out the word Emet, which means truth. Now, just a side note, in case you didn't know this, the word Emet, which means truth, consists of the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, the very middle letter of the alphabet, which is Mem, and the very last letter of the alphabet, which is Tav. So the word Emet, truth, is made up of the first, middle, and last letters of the alphabet. And this hints to the idea that truth requires us to look at the big picture. In order to really see the truth, we have to step back. We have to look at the beginning, middle, and end of a situation. If we're trying to learn the truth, we have to examine it in its entirety and not just pull out pieces that suit the story that we are trying to create, which of course is the way we usually look at situations in life, right? If we were to look at any political situation, you know, with open eyes, the truth is really usually a balance of both sides. Even when you're talking about political conservatism versus liberalism, the truth is usually a combination of both. Now, it may be more one than the other as far as it may not be equal, but to get at the truth, we have to be willing to look at the whole situation and not just to have like blinders on and look at what, appeals to us, basically. So, of course, there are loads more concepts that can be drawn from the fact that the word emet is made up of the first, middle, and last letters of the alphabet. But the mere fact that it is, I think, is totally fascinating. I mean, there's so much about Hebrew that to me is fascinating. The fact that Hebrew is the only language that was actually created by God, it was God-given. And when you look at the way it's constructed and how it works, it really makes sense that something greater and more intelligent than human beings put it together. It's just a very logical language. But anyway, so after the Sifrei Emet, right, which is the first 3 books of the 11 books of the Ketuvim, or the writings, the books of poetry. After that, we have what is called the five scrolls, or the Megillot, right? Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Megillah, right, which is the book, usually refers to the book of Esther, but there are five Megillot. There are five scrolls, and they are Song of Songs, Ruth, Echa, which is Lamentations, Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Okay, so those are the five Megillas, or Megillot in Hebrew, and they're kind of all joined together. And the interesting thing about those five books in particular is each one is read on a different holiday. So the reading of those books is kind of spread out throughout the holidays, so that if you participate in synagogue and you're reading along, then you're going to go through these each year. Now, the last three books of the Ketuvim and the Tanakh don't really fit into a category. The three books are Daniel, Ezra, and Divrei Hayamim, which is in English is usually referred to as Chronicles. All right. Now, a lot of people consider Daniel and Ezra to be prophets. Daniel clearly was a prophet, although his writings are not considered prophecy. Daniel, Ezra, and Divrei Hayamim are considered to be authored much later than any of the other books of the Tanakh. Now, they describe later events. They describe the time of the Babylonian exile or captivity. Although the book of Chronicles is interesting because basically it starts with the creation of Adam and it goes all the way through to this time of the Babylonian captivity. So it's basically an overview of Jewish history up until that point. Okay. And because of that, and it's obviously if it goes into covering part of the Babylonian exile, then clearly its authorship is later, like Daniel and Ezra. So those three books are clumped together and they're just referred to as other books. Divrei Hayamim, which is the book of Chronicles, actually means matters of the days, right? And its name in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Tanakh, means things left on the side. The name Chronicles was not actually assigned to the book until about the 5th century. I believe it was by Saint Jerome, who is the one who actually assigned it's the book. The word Chronicles is actually from I think is from the Latin, and because I think Jerome was Latin. But anyway, in a way, the Chronicles, like I said, spans the entire Bible from Adam to King Cyrus, who gave the command to rebuild the temple. All right, it was because of Cyrus that the second temple was built. Now, one last thing about those three last books, especially the two, Daniel and Ezra, they both take place during the Babylonian captivity, and they are the only two books in the entire Tanakh which contain some Aramaic. All the rest of the books of the Tanakh are written in Hebrew, but the book of Daniel and the book of Ezra have a section in them that is written in Aramaic. Okay? So when you take the first three letters of each section, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, what you get is an acronym, Tanakh. And that's what we use to refer to the Bible. All right? Bible is an English word which comes from the Latin, which just means book. But we refer to the Torah, Ketuvim, and Nevi'im, because that's a lot to say, simply as the Tanakh. Okay? So, since we have never discussed the names of the book of the Torah, if you will indulge me, we're going to actually look into that right now. But I want to stop for a second and see, does anybody have any questions? No questions? Okay. So, you may have noticed that whenever I quote from the Tanakh, I usually give the Hebrew name and the English names. Okay, it makes sense, especially because I'm teaching a group of English speakers who may or may not be familiar with the Hebrew names. And since I don't know what you're familiar with and what you're comfortable with, I give both. Okay, now some of the names are pretty easy to figure out because they're simply transliterated from the Hebrew into the English. All right, so examples, right? The book of Daniel is Daniel. Yehoshua is Joshua, right? Yehezkel is Ezekiel. All right, the name of the book is Yehezkel, but at some point when it was translated into English, it was turned into the name Ezekiel, okay? So those make sense, right? And my daughter's name is Rachel in English, it's Rachel in Hebrew. Same name, just different way of pronouncing it. But have you ever noticed that the names of the books of the Torah are very different from each other, right? It's not just like Rachel and Rachel. It's like very different, right? Genesis, Bereshit, Exodus, right? It just, which is Shemot. They're very different. So why? Well, first of all, you have to know that the books of the Torah themselves each have several names. The set of names that is commonly used in the Jewish world are simply the names of the first important word in that book. All right? And that's the way the parshas are named. Each parsha, in fact, it's interesting because originally the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, didn't have numbers in it. You know how, like, I might say, you know, Psalm 111, which is what I quoted today, right? So originally, the books didn't have chapters. The Torah especially did not have numbers. And what happened was in the Middle Ages, when the Jewish people were being brought before the church and required to debate in these public debates, we were at a disadvantage because we would tell you, okay, you know, we know Parsha Acharei, or we know Parsha Kedoshim, and we know, you know, that it's this pasuk, which means verse, but it didn't have numbers. And so the people who were in charge of the debating, you know, they would stand up and they would say, well, in Genesis 3:25 it says, and the rabbi's like, well, what's Genesis 3:25? Oh, you mean in Parsha Bereshit, the third Aliyah, the second verse? And so we actually accepted the Christian numbering system of the Bible so that we would be able to hold our own in these public debates that we were being forced to take part in. Okay. So I kind of got a little off track, but I guess I'll get back. Okay. So the Parshas are named. Each parsha has a name, and the name for each parsha is the first important word in that passage. Right now, most of the parshas in the Torah start with the words, and God said to Moses, right? So clearly, we can't name the parshas and, or God, or said, or to, or Moses, because then almost all the parshas would have the same name, which would defeat the purpose of giving it a name so that we could identify it. So sometimes it's you know, one of the early words in the parsha, and sometimes it's later. Like Bereshit, for example, happens to be the very first word of the parsha and of the book, because Bereshit means in the beginning. Okay, so the very first verse in the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So that word in the beginning is Bereshit. So that is the name of that parsha. It also happens to be the name of that book. Each of the 5 books, their first parsha is going to have the same name as the book, right? So Genesis is Bereshit, Exodus, which we call Shemot, the first parsha in Shemot is Shemot, okay? And so on. It's like that for all 5 books. Okay, just checking on my notes. All right, so the first book of the Bible, Bereshit, is called Bereshit because of the first words of the verse of the passage, which says in the beginning, or Bereshit. Okay, the second parsha of the book of Bereshit is called Noach. In English, we would say Noah. All right, that's the Hebrew name for Noah, is Noach, and the first line of that parsha reads, "These are the generations of Noah." All right, so they chose not to use the name generations. I believe there's actually another parsha that does use the name generations, but anyway, so they chose to name this parsha Noah, which is the third or fourth word in the passage. So the first word of this parsha of Noah is Elah. Elah meaning these. All right, but that's not a very important word. It doesn't tell you much about the parsha. And if I asked you, where do we find the parsha Elah, you wouldn't have an anchor. You wouldn't have something to keep. What's Elah? I don't know what Elah is, right? I mean, I know what it means. It means these, but why would you name a parsha these? It's not a significant word, okay? So you'd have no idea where to find it. So instead, the parshas are named for the first important or significant word in the parsha. In this case, the parsha of Noach, the first important word is Noach. And immediately when I say Parshat Noach, you know this is the parsha that's talking about Noah and the flood and the animals and the ark and all of that. And you also know that it's very close to the beginning of the Bible, right? Because the story of Noah happens very early on in the Torah. Now, in ancient times, the books of the Torah had more descriptive names than they have now, okay? Bereshit was actually called Maaseh Bereshit, which means the account of the beginning. Shemot, which is Exodus, was called Yetziat Mitzrayim, which means the going out from Egypt. Vayikra, which is called Leviticus in English, which isn't really English, but anyway. Vayikra was called Torat Kohanim, which means the law of the priests. That's the book that we happen to be in right now. The fourth book, Bamidbar, which is Numbers, was called Pekidim, which means counting or census. I don't know if you're picking up on a pattern here, but I'll make it a little more obvious in a minute. And the last book, Devarim or Deuteronomy, was called the Mishnah Torah, which means literally a repeat of the law or second law. All right. Now, you may be wondering, why is it important to know this? That's because the commonly used English names, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are actually the direct Greek-Latin translations of the ancient Hebrew titles. Okay, I don't know if you picked up on that. I'll go over it in a second. But so the names that we call the books now, which are for the first important word in each parsha, were not necessarily the names, the ancient names that were given to the books, which were much more descriptive. But the English names that we use for the books are anglicized Greek-Latin names, which are direct translations of the ancient Hebrew names. I hope that made sense and wasn't too confusing. So for example, Bereshit, originally called Maaseh Bereshit, which means the account or the beginning of the beginning, translates directly into Genesis in the Latin. Okay, Genesis means the beginning. Shemot was originally called, which is Exodus, was originally called Yetziat Mitzrayim, which means going out, or Exodus from Egypt. And it translates into, yep, you guessed it, Exodus, okay? So we'll just go straight down the line. Vayikra, which is Leviticus, okay, was originally called, the ancient Hebrew name is Torat Kohanim, which means the laws of the priests. Translates directly into Leviticus. Leviticus is Latin for the Levites, who are, right, the Kohanim, the priests are of the tribe of Levi. So it makes sense. It comes from the Levites, and it means the priestly book. All right. And then you have Bamidbar, which is numbers in English, right? Originally called Pekidim, which means counting or census, and census translates into numbers. That works, right? And then the last one, Devarim, which is Deuteronomy, was originally called the Mishnah Torah, which means the repeat of the law or the second law, and translates directly into Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy. Onomi, I don't know what the O is in there, but nomi being law and deuter meaning second. So it means literally the second law, and that's a direct translation of Mishnah Torah. So the English names are simply translations of the ancient Hebrew names of the books. All right, makes sense? So while it's always preferable to use the Hebrew when you're in a Jewish context, there's nothing wrong with using the Latin, Greek, English names. Like I said, they're just a direct translation of the ancient Hebrew names. That being said, if you don't know the Hebrew names, you should learn them. You should make it a priority to learn them. One of the biggest things that I have taught people over the years, and that I spend a lot of time teaching people who are newly religious or newly converting, is how to fit into the Jewish community culturally. I mean, the Orthodox Jewish community has a very specific culture, and you don't have to learn these things, but learning them will help you to feel more a part of the community and will help you get accepted more easily because people will be more comfortable with you. If you use the word Hashem, which is how culturally most Orthodox Jews refer to God instead of the Lord, see, there's nothing wrong with saying the Lord, but culturally, in the Jewish community, we don't refer to God as the Lord. In fact, we do say God, but not, the preference is to use Hashem. So, yeah, you can say the Lord. There's no sin in that. But if you want to make people feel more comfortable with you and to be comfortable around you, and you want to fit into the culture of the Jewish community, using the name Hashem would be preferable to saying the Lord, okay? And it's the same thing with these books of the Torah, of the Bible, right? I can say Tanakh, or I can say Bible. But if I say Bible, most Jewish people kind of, that's the Christian thing, right? No, it's just English, anglicized from the Latin or the Greek, or Latin, I'm pretty sure. But there's a culture. And in the Jewish world, we don't usually refer to the Tanakh as the Bible. We usually either call it the Tanakh, or sometimes the word Torah is used as a more overarching, generalized word. Even though the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes Torah is more loosely used to describe all of the Tanakh, or even the Talmud, the Gemara, because Torah just means law. It just means the what God handed down to us. So again, there's nothing wrong with using the English names, but people will be more comfortable with you if you use the Hebrew names. Okay? Are there any questions? Okay, no questions. Then I will move on to the next part. Okay, so this week's Parsha is called Emor, all right? The first sentence of the Parsha is, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Emor el HaKohanim, Bnei Aharon, Ve'amarta Alehem Lenefesh, Li Yitama Be'amayov. Anyway, sorry about the way I read that. The font that I used is hard for me to read. What it says in English is, and the Lord said to Moses, again, you know, the translation is, and the Lord, but normally we don't say that. Hashem said to Moses, Moshe, speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, let none of you defile himself for a dead person among his people. Now, remember how I said that the name of each parsha is for the first important word in the parsha? Well, that's usually the case. Since if we went with the first actual word, though, the vast majority of parshas would be called Vayomer, because many of the parshas start with the word Vayomer, and he said, okay, because most of the parshas are God telling Moses to tell something to the Jewish people. All right, so we would have a ton of parshas named Vayomer, and that doesn't work. But in this case, the word Emor, which, by the way, is from the root Vayomer, okay, the word Emor, it's not actually such an important word, right? It just means to speak. And you would think that that would also be a word that comes up a bunch of times. Actually, Emor in that form is somewhat rare. 2 of the times are in this week's parsha. But the significant thing about this parsha is that the word speak or say happens 3 times in one sentence. It says Vayomer, and he said, Emor, speak to the sons of Israel. The Amartem, which is also from the same word Amar, and say to them. Now, if you remember me mentioning last week, the Torah is actually written very tersely. That is, that there are no words wasted, and an awful lot that's actually left out. That's why we have to rely on the oral Torah, right? Because there's so much left out. So if the Torah leaves so much out, when there is a redundancy, the rule of thumb is that we must ask why, right? No wasted words in the Torah. So if it comes up more than once, and in this case it's 3 times, we have to ask why. So why is the word speak used 3 times in this sentence? So first of all, usually when we read the parsha, the sentence begins Vayidaber Hashem. Okay, yidaber, daber is to speak. It's just slightly nuanced difference, you know, vidaber and to speak versus vayomer and to say. All right. In English, there's really not much of a difference between speaking and saying. But in the Hebrew, there is a difference. So most of the time, the sentences don't actually start with vayomer, they start with the yidaber. But almost all the time, whether it started with vayomer or it started with vayidaber, it always tells Moshe to daber el, to speak to whomever, the children of Israel. Sometimes the instruction is the whole nation. Sometimes the instruction is just the leaders. Other times, God's telling him to speak to the priests. That's what it's saying in this parsha. So it's saying to repeat these instructions word for word. When God tells Moshe l'daber, to speak to whoever, he's telling them, repeat the words that I'm about to tell you, okay? But in this parsha, the word emor and lemor, from the word amar, which means to say, is a more roundabout way, right? It's more distant, and yet in some ways it's actually more specific. It's not saying repeat word for word, it's saying communicate. Make sure that when you tell them, they understand, because this is like really important. Don't just repeat my words word for word, which is usually the instruction that God is giving Moses. In this case, he's saying, make sure to use whatever words you need to in order to communicate the concept. Make sure they understand. That's what God is telling him when he says emor rather than daber. Okay? Make sure you communicate. Make sure that you use whatever words you need to use, not necessarily the words that I used. any words you need to use to communicate this concept, because the concept is so very important. Why is it so very important that these concepts are communicated in whatever manner necessary? Because this concerns the ability of a priest to do his job. Remember, the Kohen is responsible for bringing the sacrifices in the temple on behalf of individuals and on behalf of the nation. It's a very, very important job. He facilitates the connection between mankind and God. All right. So for the priest, becoming defiled makes him ineligible to do the very thing he was created to do, to fulfill his purpose in this world. And that's a big deal. He needs to understand the severity of his situation and the importance of taking the precautions necessary to avoid it. So the Parsha begins by instructing Moshe to tell the Kohanim, the priests, about the things that will make the priest unfit for service in the temple. And repeatedly throughout this section, we see the phrase, "for he is holy to his God." Okay? That's really important to stop and think about that. God's saying, this guy, this priest, has a very, very important job to do on behalf of the entire nation of Israel. He's holy, he's separated, he's got a very special job to do, and therefore he needs to understand that if he does these things, he's going to be unfit for service, and that's going to be a problem. So then the Parsha moves on to talking about what makes a Kohen unfit for service, from that to what makes an animal unfit for an offering. So it's talking about blemishes, it's talking about all sorts of things. And then we have this sentence that tells us when an ox, sheep, or goat is born, that is, animals that can be used for offerings, they are to remain under their mother. That's the phrase, under their mother, for a full week before they can be taken away and used for an offering. On the other hand, it makes sense because the Parsha, on the one hand, it makes sense because the Parsha was just talking about what animals can be offered and which cannot. And one of the parameters is that an animal under a week old cannot be offered. But the question, which is not answered in this Parsha, but is answered elsewhere, is why? Why? Because it's cruel to take a baby away from its mother immediately after she's given birth. Now, one could argue that it's always cruel to take a baby away from its mother until it's reached maturity. But it's a different level of cruel to do it while she's still recovering from the act of giving birth. I mean, her body's going through all this stuff, and she's keenly aware of the fact that she's just had a baby. And the one thing that she wants to do, that her body and her mind need to complete the process, is to care for and nurture this baby, right? To feed the baby, to relieve her body of the milk that has, come in order to feed the baby. So the Torah tells us you can take a baby animal from its mother, but not until it's 8 days old. Why? Because as you've heard me say many, many, many times before, Judaism is about compassion. That is one of the major overarching, yes, it's about holiness, but it's about compassion. So we have this whole category of rules that are referred to as Tsar Balei Chayim, which literally means the suffering of animals. Right? And these laws include today's rule about not taking a baby away from its mother until it's at least 8 days old. The rules also include that animals must not be worked on Shabbat. We are forbidden to muzzle an ox to prevent it from eating while it's working in the field. If the ox is providing labor for us, then we have to allow it to eat as it works. By the way, there's a similar rule regarding human beings. And if you have a worker who's working in the field, he has to be permitted to eat. You're not allowed to stop him from eating. We may not plow a field using different animals of different species, because that would be a hardship to those animals. We also must relieve an animal of its burdens. If we see an animal stressing under a heavy burden, we're supposed to relieve the animal, even if the owner is our enemy or if the animal is ownerless. Now, you could ask, why would an animal be carrying a burden if he didn't have an owner? But that's another question. All right, so we're not allowed to kill an animal on the same day as its offspring. So if you have a goat and you have a baby goat, you may not kill them on the same day. Whether or not they know about it is not the point. You're not allowed to do it. All right, and then also we are commanded to send away a mother bird when taking the eggs, because of the psychological distress it would cause the animal. So for instance, some of you who are friends with me on Facebook may have noticed that I am raising chickens, okay? And I'm doing that because I don't want to support the egg industry and the chicken industry, the commercial, conventional industry, which does not treat animals ethically, okay? So that's my personal conviction. So I have these chickens. Right now I have 4 adults and I just got 18 babies. And the hens occasionally get into a mood, which is referred to as being broody, all right? What that means is that they decide that they want to hatch some eggs. And they'll sit on their eggs, as well as any eggs from any of the other hens that laid also, in order to do so. So they'll do this even if there's no rooster around and their eggs are unfertilized. They don't know that the eggs are unfertilized. They don't know that the eggs aren't going to produce babies. They will sit there on those eggs for 21 days, barely eating or drinking anything at all, just sitting there trying to hatch their eggs. That means that not only are they not eating and drinking, but they also stop laying eggs. And this is very counterproductive when the reason that you're keeping them is for their eggs, right? So I recently had a broody hen, and I needed to get her out of the nest so she would go eat, and also because I needed the eggs. But also, if you leave the eggs under her, they're going to spoil. They're not going to turn into chicks because they're not fertilized. So that would be a waste. Plus, then the hen is not eating and drinking. So every day after putting out the food for my girls, I would go into the nest and I would pick up my broody hen and I would shoo her out of the nest so that she would go eat and so that I could collect her eggs. Now, yes, doing that does cause some distress, but not nearly as much distress as if I took the eggs out from under her while she was sitting on them. In fact, she doesn't like that at all. She'll make all sorts of noise. And I was watching a video of somebody who had a broody hen, and he actually pulled the eggs out from under her and instead of shooing her away. And boy, was she making noise, and she was pecking at his hands, and clearly she was not happy. So by sending her out of the nest to go eat and do whatever else she needs to do, it allows you to take the eggs without causing that extra distress. See, Judaism says that I can have those eggs for food. It's a basic human need, and that's what the animals are here for. One of the reasons that they exist is to help provide for our basic needs, even if it does distress the chicken. But I have to do it in the least distressing way possible, because otherwise I will become hardened to the suffering of another living being, and that will lead to even greater transgressions. See, while it's true that man has been given dominion over the animals, they've been given to us for our benefit, we are not permitted to cause them unnecessary suffering. Certain situations where halacha does allow some amount of suffering to animals. But when we cross the line from necessary to unnecessary, we cross the line not only from causing unnecessary suffering of the animals, but we also damage our own souls. Like I said, Judaism is about compassion. We should never allow ourselves to become hardened to the suffering of animals, because that is a slippery slope to become hardened to the suffering of humans. And it was this sin for which Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Okay, there's actually a phrase called the salt of Sodom, which refers to this idea of filling ourselves and then becoming hardened to the needs of others, that there are others that maybe don't have food to eat or stuff like that. And by the way, in addition to the laws that I listed above, we are permitted also to violate Shabbat to a limited extent, and the Gemara has lots of information about what extent that is, but we are permitted to violate Shabbat to a limited extent in order to rescue an animal that is in pain or at risk of death. Okay? In the Talmud, the rabbis further ruled that a person may not purchase an animal unless he has made provisions to feed it. All right? A person must feed his animals before he feeds himself. You're not allowed to have animals if you can't afford to feed them. All right? Now, the laws concerning how an animal must be slaughtered in order to be kosher are also supposed to kill the animal in the quickest way possible, minimizing the trauma and suffering to the animal. A lot of people in conventional farms and stuff like that, they're all about, you got to stun the cow with a bullet to the head before you kill it. And that's supposed to be more humane, except for the fact that the process that they do it, the poor animal is scared to death. It's visible. You can see the fear of the cows. And oftentimes after they're shot in the head, they don't actually become unconscious for quite some time. So there's a tremendous amount of suffering that goes on. Whereas kosher slaughter cuts across the carotid artery so that literally they feel pain for only a split second and then they're unconscious. And so they don't suffer the same way that conventionally killed animals suffer. Just one last note, you should also know that it is also a violation of Jewish law to neuter a pet. All right? The Torah absolutely prohibits the castrating of males of any species, and in fact, that's in this week's Parsha, in Leviticus or Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 24. And that makes mention specifically of castration. There is also another verse, I don't have the reference for you, but it says that we are not permitted to make any animal barren. Okay, and we could get into all the reasons why, and I'm not going to right now. But you should also know that while we are not permitted to neuter an animal, the halacha, the Jewish law, does not forbid us from owning an animal which has already been neutered. So many Jewish people will choose to adopt animals for a shelter since the animals in the shelter are already neutered. Now, these days, there are so many suffering and abandoned pets that neutering does seem to be the most compassionate thing to do. So the way that we deal with that and the way that we can exercise that compassion is by getting a pet that has already been taken care of. Right? By the way, the laws of Tsar Balei Chayim also apply to physically altering an animal in any way without a genuine, legitimate need. So that includes declawing cats and docking the ears or tails of dogs. Okay, again, there's no prohibition against owning such animals, but we may not be the ones to cause that to happen. I'm sorry if I spent so much time on this topic, but I felt that it was something that we should probably talk about because of the important role that it plays in Judaism. All right, that's all I have for you today. So if you want to unmute yourself, I welcome any discussion, any questions that you have or anything. Yeah. So anybody? I'm going to unmute you guys. Jan, you're unmuted, and Virginia, you're unmuted. So yeah, so what did you think? Any concepts, any thoughts about today's talk?
You can unmute us, but you can't make us
I can't,
talk.
right. I can lead the horse to water, but I can't make it drink. No. Yeah. So yeah, if you don't have any questions, that's fine. If you don't have anything to say, that's also fine. But, you know, I like discussion, and so many times this class is just me talking for an hour and everybody's silent. And I guess I should be flattered because that means that you're interested in what I have to say. But it also means it's not very interactive, which I really want to make sure that everybody is getting what they need to out of the group. And so I want to allow for that. Okay. Does anybody have anything else to say? Okay. So, right, we'll have class again next week. I'm asking everybody that can to go ahead and pay for the last part of May and the beginning of June, or all of June. And yeah, so we'll start next week, probably looking again, continuing our way through the prayers in the Siddur, and we'll go from there. Shavuot is in 3 weeks, I think. So I have to check the timing of that because something in my head is telling me that it may overlap with Sunday. So we may take 1 week off for Shavuot. But if anybody has any questions on Shavuot, please feel free to post them in the group or send them to me privately. That's fine too, so that I can make sure that any relevant questions are asked and answered. Okay?
Great. Looking forward to next week.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.